Good evening, everyone. My name is Vasily Shadrin. I teach for History Department and the School of Religion. And I'm also running the group called the Russian and Eastern European Studies Network at Queen's, the interdisciplinary group that aims to bring larger awareness of the things Russian, Eastern European, even Eurasian to Queens, and we exist for the past 5 years already, and we're doing events, we have group meetings, we're doing many things. And I now, before we start our today's talk, I want to give the floor to one of my students from the undergraduate students group of the Russian and Eastern European Studies Network, Gili Galar, please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor. I just wanted to mention a little bit about the very relevant and growing group that we have on campus. With myself, along with a few lovely ladies and gentlemen in the back, if you guys want to raise your hands. A few of us have been participating, at least for me, it's new this past semester, taking place in contemporary and historical discussions surrounding texts, music, culture, everything Russia and Eastern Europe. We share our stories, our family stories. Professor shares a lot of his stories, and we're very active, and we have a lot of events coming up and have a lot of events in the past. You can check us out on Instagram or Facebook as well at Rees, Russian and Eastern European Studies Group. We cook, we dance, we listen to music. It's a blast. It's a lot of fun, especially on the weekends as well. So if you're interested in anything like that, you can come speak to me or talk to me or anyone else who's raised their hands before. We'd love to chat and welcome anyone who is interested in joining. Thank you.
Thank you, Gili. Okay, today we meet to talk about the war and propaganda, pretty relevant topic these days. And our speaker today will be Garner, who's the graduate of University of Toronto, specializing in very Russian combination of politics, history, and comparative literature. And also from the St. Petersburg Conservatory of Music in guitar. And now teaching for the political studies at Queen's. Jan will speak on his very recently published book about the Stalingrad and the propaganda, literature, cultural aspects of this. Let's welcome Jan Garner.
Perfect. I've got to remember to position myself in front of this computer, otherwise I'll wander in and out of shot for the Zoom crowd. But firstly, thank you for having me. Thank you for coming, especially on what is a very grim and frozen day outside. I appreciate you hacking in person, and I was a little worried a couple of hours ago that it would be me spewing my words into a vacuum with nobody to listen. This is indeed a talk about my just published book, Stalingrad Lives, Stories of Combat and Survival. It's a real book that was recently described by my mother as not as violent as she expected. So, there you are, the seal of maternal approval is all I ever really wanted. All right, but that's about where the laughter ends on this topic, I'm afraid. What we want to talk about today is Russia past and Russia present, because this is a story that seemed to occupy Russians. And we are talking, even though it was born in the Soviet Union, we are talking about a particularly Russian and a Russian nationalist kind of a story, even when it professed to speak for all Soviet citizens. It's a story that is relevant today. We see on the top left, flags being drawn up the Kurgan in the heart of Stalingrad. This is where the heaviest fighting took place and where we'll see thousands of people died. And you might recognize the Motherland Call statue, which at one time was the largest, highest statue in the world, and was a very flimsy Soviet construction that repeatedly almost fell apart, and they had to spend a lot of money fixing. This is a story about the very recent present, this picture on the top right, just from this week. A new battalion has been sent to Ukraine named after Stalingrad. This is the Stalingrad Battalion. And you can see them again being assembled for a PR opportunity, photographed by TASS and RIA Novosti. And that was well publicized by various propagandists. And of course, when that battalion was described, as we'll see, the news articles and the news writers drew on a language that was born at the front in 1942. And it was a language that was produced by journalists. In the bottom right, we have a series of journalists, left to right, Vasily Karataev, who nobody's ever heard of, but is an interesting figure. We have Konstantin Simonov, a very famous Soviet author who is not very well known in the West, but I think one of the better of the official writers. And on the right-hand side, one of my personal heroes, David Ortenberg, who was the editor of the Red Star newspaper during the war and is a fascinating figure who was always torn between officialdom and pushing against it. The bottom left, we have the responses that I'll address of ordinary readers who embraced, even as the battle was being fought, the story of Stalingrad that was being constructed in the newspapers and turned it into something that informed their memories and informed wider popular understanding of the war with, really for the time, astonishing rapidity. But let's think, before we go backwards, let's think a little bit more about the present. Does anyone know when this was? This was the 24th of February, declaration of special military operation, if you can call it such a thing. And in that speech, Putin drew on comparisons between the past and the present. He drew on a language of war. He told Russians that there were fundamental threats to the country that echoed the threat posed in 1941 by Germany, that Russia was on the brink of some sort of annihilation, and that Russia had to defend itself, that Russia was under an existential, his word, Nazi threat, of course, nonsense. And Putin's regime has been drawing on the memory of the so-called Great Patriotic War for the last 20 and counting years. And the memory of the war for them has been of Russia as a kind of a white knight, defending itself, but also saving the world, purportedly, from the threat of the Nazi invading forces. In this story, of course, non-Russian minorities are left out. I have to preface my story by pointing this out, that we don't hear too much about the Kazakhs, about the Central Asians, about the Buryats who were fighting in Stalingrad. We don't hear very much about, certainly about Ukrainians, and we hear very little also about women. This is a masculine, white, ethnic Russian kind of a story. And this is, of course, a story of a squeaky clean Red Army. And in Putin's Russia, certainly discussion of rapes, violence, disciplinary issues. You might have heard about executions at the front. All of these things are not spoken of today and have effectively in public discourse been criminalized. You simply can't mention it. Now, the Kremlin today is using a language of war to justify what it's doing. Right? And it's using language drawn from the war, just as Putin has done throughout his presidency. And I want to draw your attention to the ways in which he's discussed Stalingrad and has made Stalingrad central to his story and Russia's story today, very briefly. So back in 2018, when he was campaigning to be re-elected president, he made one of his fairly regular pilgrimages, and I choose that word deliberately, to Volgograd today. And this is him in the memorial complex at Stalingrad. There is this sort of great bronze copper, it's almost a sort of a temple, a shrine to the memory of the war. And he went there and he spoke to veterans and he attended a concert. This is February 2018. And these were the words he said. Stalingrad was turned into an invincible, impregnable fortress to halt the progress of Nazism. Our Soviet soldiers and our wounded land were as one. Our soldiers turned every street, trench, house, and firing point into a fortress. The locals fought the enemy just as bravely. Do those words sound familiar to some of you who sort of read about Stalingrad and read about the war? Well, as well they might, because if we go back to 1942, this is from October 1942, here are some words from an editorial that was written by some of the writers at the front. Every house in Stalingrad has become an impregnable fortress. Stalingrad's defenders are fighting for every house, every barn, and every garden. Every house has become a firing position. Stalingrad's defenders are performing miracles of bravery, dedication, and loyalty to and for the motherland. Isn't this fascinating? This is almost the same line. And what we hear when we hear the story of Stalingrad as it's told by Russians today is almost word for word verbatim story that was produced by writers at the front. And the Soviet Union sent its very best writers to the front to live and work with the troops. Many of them died with the troops. And of course, you all know that the Second World War was terribly bloody and exacted an enormous death toll on the Soviet invaders. When everything else was collapsing in Russia in the 1990s, the state resurrected this story. It dragged it back. It was what Sergei Ushakin calls the only remaining sacrality that the state had. If it couldn't believe in capitalism, and it certainly couldn't believe in communism anymore, then it could at least believe in the idea that the war was something holy, that sacrifice had been something that was worthwhile. And today, the nation obsesses, I think, at least the ethnic Russian parts of the nation and the more patriotic leaning elements of the Russian nation over the idea of fictitious Stalingrad. This is not a real version of Stalingrad in which Russia sacrificed itself, Russia died to save the world. And this book, Stalingrad Lives, is all about how and why this should be the case. It came out of originally my PhD research, which was about the kind of the wider myth of Stalingrad as it emerged and fluctuated over a period of several decades. And this is really just the first chapter blown up. What happened August 1942 to February 1943 when Stalingrad was being fought? And ultimately, the story that was created was a story, not probably the story of Stalingrad that you know, in which Stalingrad is a byword for cold, freezing soldiers, death, senseless destruction, the awful kind of obliterative nature of technologized warfare. Right? That's probably what most people in the West think of when they think of Stalingrad. This is a story of, on the right-hand side, this is an illustration from a book of Stalingrad stories published just after the battle had finished. This is a story in which the world is miraculously resurrected, in which a sacrifice had to occur. And you will immediately see there is a comparison with kind of Christian theology, the idea that people had to die, something had to die. It wasn't a regrettable sacrifice to save the world. And supposedly when Russia fights today, when we hear that today's battles are like Stalingrad or the new Stalingrad, this is the myth to which speakers are alluding. So very briefly, for those of you who don't know much about the history of Stalingrad, I will give you a 2-minute potted version. The war starts in June 1941. It's a terrible disaster for the Soviets. They're supposed to be ready, they're not. They fold pretty fast. Moscow almost falls in December 1941. The military history types argue endlessly over whether that would have been the war in the East. I'm minded to believe it probably wouldn't have been. There would have been messy partisan warfare, but that's by the by. The Germans are beaten back. And the next summer, they have another go. Starting in June, they start a new offensive. It's called Operation Blue, where basically, and I'm sorry that the picture is very tiny here, but I couldn't find a really great example that would show this to you. They start off here, the red territory. They're going to scream down here. And what are they going to do? And I apologize to those of you who are watching on camera, I've disappeared. They are going to come from here, march down here, all the way to the oil fields in the Caucasus onto Baku. They're going to cut the Soviet Union off from its oil supplies and thus win the war. And what happens? Well, you can see these gentle yellow colors and this little city here. They get stuck at Stalingrad. And both sides pour in huge amounts of troops into Stalingrad. The battle begins more or less on the 23rd of August, 1942, with what can only really be described as an apocalyptic bombing raid. Thousands of people die. The city's on fire. Something like, I think, 10 to 15% of the city's housing stock is destroyed in one night. And you can read the accounts in the book of what it was like to be there, to see people burning and screaming in the streets. And I apologize, there is going to be some fairly graphic description from time to time in the talk. This is an awful time. It looks like the Soviet Union is going to fall. People believe that the Soviet Union is going to fall, that this time this is it. That the Nazi invaders are not just going to win our territory, conquer our territory, they're going to murder us. They're going to murder the idea of Russianness, the idea of Sovietness. These things will simply cease to exist. The belief is that this is an existential war. Throughout the first couple of months of the fall, there is bloody street fighting and fighting along what's really quite a long front. You can see how long this front is, where the orange parts are. This is all becomes, or at least a good chunk of it becomes, the Stalingrad front. There is basically a quagmire. Both sides are sending in more and more troops. The death toll is phenomenal. At times, 10,000 people are dying on the Soviet side a day, which is just unimaginable when you look up how many people are dying on the Western front and on the North African front at the same time. November the 19th, essentially a miracle happens, or at least as described by the authors that I'm going to describe today, when the Soviets launch a counterattack, mostly with tanks. They surround the German army at Stalingrad, and that's basically the beginning of the end for the Germans on the Eastern Front. The images that you know of sacrifice or of freezing, starving troops, that's the Germans struggling to see out November, December, January in Stalingrad, while Hitler refuses to actually do anything to help them because he is notoriously not a good dude. And you can quote me on that. And they finally surrender February 3rd, 1943. And then the Soviets march on to Berlin. That's the beginning of the end for Hitler on the Eastern Front. This is a great victory. Nobody expects it to come. And when it does happen, November the 19th, it happens really, really quickly, astonishingly quickly. So that's Stalingrad. Let's talk about the writers. Back in June 1941, if you think that the army is unprepared, you should have seen the state of the propaganda apparatus, because they do not know what's hit them. There are no preparations. There are no pre-prepared articles to be published in the newspapers. There is no radio broadcast that's slated to go out. Everything is thrown together slapdash on the spot. But the Soviets recognize early on the problems that they have, very early on, because on the second or third day of the war, I'd have to look it up using this fabulous book because I know it's in there. They form Sovinformbureau, the Soviet Information Agency. This is going to control information flow during the war. They put a guy, Alexander Shcherbakov, in charge of it. He's basically your worst picture of a Soviet apparatchik. He's, you know, pretty craven, pretty nasty, unpleasant sort of a dude. But he realizes he needs good men to produce good literature and good writing. And the Soviets conceive of writing at this time as, to quote Ilya Ehrenburg, who is one of the many writers who ends up writing for these newspapers, they conceive of writing as a spiritual weapon. This is just as important for them as bullets and bombs. They know they need this to boost morale, to tell people on the home front and at the fighting front, we need you to keep going. As bleak as things are, you have to believe in the possibility that the future is coming. One of the issues they constantly face in the early months of the war is the idea that the war is going to continue in perpetuity. That this war is so great, is so enormous, it will never end. This is simply the state of humanity, the state of existence for now. And so Shcherbakov sends for good writers, and he makes Ortenberg, who is also pictured on the top right here, the left, and on the right-hand side in this bottom picture here. He makes Ortenberg the editor of Krasnaya Zvezda. And Ortenberg is basically allowed free rein to do more or less what he wants. In the 1930s, he put his neck on the line to try and, in a more minor role he had, advocate for writers who'd been proscribed, who'd been punished who weren't in the best books of the regime. Now he does it again. He visits Stalin, he visits Shcherbakov, and he says, these guys that you didn't love so much, these guys that were in jail, I need them. And he gets the green light. They're totally okay with it. All sins are forgotten. And in fact, the same is happening in the army at the time. They're bringing people back in. They realize whatever else is happening, whatever sort of moral and ideological crimes somebody might have committed at this time, if you can help the war effort, we'll have you back. So Ortenberg assembles a crack team. Who does this include? This includes, most famously, Vasily Grossman, who goes to Stalingrad, the author of the two most famous novels probably about Stalingrad in the West. The first, Stalingrad, as it's named in the English translation, although that wasn't the original Russian title. I won't go into it now, but you can ask me about it because I have very strong feelings, as you probably tell. And Life and Fate, which is the one everybody knows. Life and Fate, 1961, Grossman recounts on all the propagandizing he did for the regime during the war and says, this is my suicide note. And that was a word that I believe, according to one of his friends, that he used. And Ortenberg assembles this team. They're all quite eager to join. And there is a myth about Grossman that he's the only one. He's the only person in Stalingrad. He's kind of a lone wolf. And that he never wanted to join the war effort. He never wanted to propagandize for the regime. Is absolute nonsense. All of the writers that I'm talking about rush to enlist. Jewish writers, Ukrainian writers, Russian writers. They all see that the threat posed by the invading force is even worse than the things that have happened to them in the preceding decade. And Ortenberg basically sends them off with almost no direction. They're integrated into the regular military. They're given military ranks. They're given access to military communication lines. And Ortenberg simply says, go find interesting stories, send me at least 2 stories a week. And they do. And off they go to the front. And for the first few months, it's chaos because the whole military is in chaos. They struggle to produce material. They don't know what's going to work. They don't know what's effective. But by the time Stalingrad rolls around, they've had a lot of practice and they've figured out what works. The other thing that I think is important to note at this point is the effective end of censorship for these writers. And the figures, when I found them, were quite astonishing. In the second quarter of 1942, so just before Stalingrad, in Red Star, the newspaper that David Ortenberg is writing for, 815 articles were published. Only 5 were outright refused by the censors. And nobody was packed off to the Gulag. Nobody was demoted. Nobody was reprimanded for what they wrote. They were allowed to write what they thought was correct. Of course, what they wanted to write, they were governed by something of a self-censorship, right? They weren't entirely naive. They didn't start writing 2 fingers up to Stalin. But this fear that, you know, I might put a foot wrong, I might spell something wrong. And the classic is the apocryphal story that somebody once wrote Stalingrad instead of Stalingrad. Stalin shit instead of Stalin town, for those of you who aren't Russian speakers, and got packed off to the Gulag. It's nonsense. It just didn't happen. Not yet. It will do. We'll get there. Don't worry. Right. And what they write is fiction. They understand very quickly that material that simply lists numbers of dead, that tries to shock with facts and figures and statistics, isn't effective propaganda. It creates what psychologists call psychic numbing. That is, there's only so many times you can hear 100,000 people are dead, 1 million people are dead, and it ceases to really mean anything. And you know what? We've all seen it with COVID, right? 1 million people are dead, 2 million people are dead. It doesn't really have a huge impact on us anymore. We've heard the figures so much, right? The same is true here, but on a much bigger scale. So what do? Well, these writers are tortured and traumatized by what's happening just as much as everybody else, just as much as their readers. So they draw on socialist realism. And socialist realism, if you don't know, is supposedly the official genre of the Soviet Union. Everything has to be socialist realist in all sorts of art. And socialist realism, this is why it's useful in war, focuses on ordinary people who do miraculous things. And it describes them in highly formulaic ways. It's like almost like building writing out of little blocks of Lego. You know, you just drag and drop them in, bit by bit by bit. It doesn't require great sort of poetic inspiration. You don't have to sit there and stare out the window and wait for beauty to blow in on the breeze. Right? And this is boring most of the time. But when you transpose it into a wartime context, when we're not talking about the amount of cement we're producing in socialist realism, we're talking about, here is the real story of a soldier who cares about his family, who exceeded his production target of killing Germans. People care a lot more. It makes this genre that's been moribund, that's been boring, rather more effective. And you'll find that when it's done in the hands of really good writers like Grossman and Simonov, and I've translated all of Simonov's 4 Stalingrad stories in here and 5 of Grossman's, including 2 that have never been translated into English before, you will find that this makes for quite good literature. These aren't masterpieces. Life and Fate is a masterpiece, certainly. This is not there yet, but this is engaging literature. It's emotional, it's artistic in its own way. But what they can also draw on is not just the stock propaganda tropes of the 1930s. They also now find themselves, I can draw on references to 18th century Russian odes. I can draw on references to Tolstoy, to War and Peace. I can put these things together bit by bit by bit. I can draw on references to Russian folk stories, whatever I want. This process is beginning before the war in some ways. But now these artists feel they really have free rein to produce whatever they want. And so these stories that go into the newspapers, and by the next year, by 1942, when Stalingrad starts, there are 14 million newspapers being published every day and being circulated across the Soviet Union. This is how people are understanding what's happening in the war. These are the stories that shape people's understanding of life, not the news reports on page 1, which are tedious and dull and don't really represent reality very well because the Soviets had a tendency to lie a bit about what was really happening at the front. This is the stuff that people identified. This is the means with which people recognize their own trauma, recognize their own suffering. So let me show you what the writers were doing at Stalingrad. And the first thing we have to understand is that here is Stalingrad, and I apologize, camera people, I went the map again. So you can see Stalingrad is on the bend of a river here. And the writers aren't stationed way off here. They're stationed right here, on the bank of the river, in a little village called Akhtuba. It's a tiny little hamlet. And every day, they make trips in and out of the city, sometimes spending several days there at a time. They live with the troops. They fight with the troops. And Grossman is the first to arrive in late August. He sets the scene. When he arrives, he says that Stalingrad was, quote, a burned out dead city. He sees destroyed schools, destroyed homes, universities, hospitals. In his diary, he kind of compulsively reiterates, as if traumatically, the words Stalingrad is burning, Stalingrad is burning, Stalingrad is burning. He writes it down over and over again by hand. The city, Grossman wrote, had died. It had the face of a man dead from a serious illness and now at eternal rest, more and more bombing of a city that's already dead. Stalingrad is symbolically sacrificed in this world, and pretty soon that trope of the dead city becomes central to what Stalingrad is in these first couple of months of the battle. So soon, Ortenberg and Simonov turn up, and what everybody finds is scenes of tragedy and trauma. This is the Volga River. The crossing becomes incredibly dangerous as the Soviet army is essentially driven back to only having one tiny foothold on the west bank of the river. And the city's residents, there are only about 15,000 left. You can ask Professor Manley about the not great evacuation they did. Indeed, I believe I quote you in the book, so good job. There are only 15,000 residents left in the city by the end of the battle. Those who remain are living in caves, living in bunkers, living in potholes, living in sewers along the edge of the river, wherever they can find a space. And you might, if some of you know the photographs or go looking for them, you might find these awful photographs of just reams of destroyed houses with sort of smokestacks, chimneys, and nothing else. So off they go. They fight, they write, they work together. And what these writers do is start to not just recycle propaganda tropes, but they start to recycle each other's material as well. And so Grossman will write up a story. Boris Polyovoy, who is another relatively well-known Soviet writer, reads this story of a particular division, says, this is a really good story. He writes his own response. He writes his own version of the story. This is a sort of fast-track mythologization of the battle done by these writers who are living and working together. And it is terrifically dangerous. What they're doing is traumatic, it's exhausting. And Vasily Karateyev, you remember that picture of the three journalists I pointed to? Vasily Karateyev is a native Stalingrader. This is his own city, and he was writing for the local Pravda newspaper. And he's pulled into writing for the central newspapers. He's the most traumatized of all of them. And in his writing in the book, you can see him drawing out material from the other writers, who all say, when we were looking at Vasily at the front, we were deeply worried about this man, who couldn't stop crying, who didn't understand what was happening, and yet who used his writing to kind of work through publicly what was happening. And you don't really see anything like that in the Soviet 1930s in the literary canon. This is a very sort of confrontational, it's a very frank and it's a very human kind of a story, even as it becomes monumental. And one of the ways it becomes monumental is in the issue of time. And Konstantin Simonov writes this story, Days and Nights, that I think best expresses the issue of time. In Days and Nights, and I have it translated in here, he bookends a trip, a first-person trip to Stalingrad, with a sort of epic beginning and an epic end. An epic beginning in which he says, we'll never forget Stalingrad. When I look at it behind me, I understand this is a battle that's going to go down in history. At the end, he broadens it out onto this vast time frame, stating that this is something that we will exact revenge on the Germans for forever. And in the middle, he takes a trip into Stalingrad across the Volga. And the Volga functions as this sort of Styx-like river, a river into hell. And Stalingrad is repeatedly described as being hell. A trip across the underworld in which people symbolically die. And he meets a young nurse on this crossing who says, I've been seriously injured 3 or 4 times. I'm too young to die. I have too much to live for. I almost died, but I'm coming back. And so off she goes into Stalingrad again, across this boundary between life and death, constantly dying, being resurrected, as the city itself is supposed to be resurrected. In the issue of time, though, Simonov seems stuck. In this city, days and nights go on endlessly, the one turning into the other. And the story is beautifully, each section prefaced with this little anaphoric opening. It's morning. Story, story, story. It's daytime. Story, story, story. It's nighttime. Story, story, story. It's morning. It's daytime. It's nighttime. And on and on and on. And he has this beautiful section where he describes seeing the ghost of a policeman in central Stalingrad, imagining as if he was still conducting traffic today. And he goes into a destroyed apartment and sees an exercise book that's got a half-finished sentence. And he says, as if life were paused. It's as if he can't imagine what the future is going to be. That this sort of utopian revelation, this great moment that comes on the 19th of November just hasn't happened or can't happen yet. As things get worse, the response of the new arrivals in turn gets more and more extreme. And I just want to read you a passage that's from mid-October, written by Yevgeny Krieger, who was a screenwriter recruited into the army, notoriously, according to his colleagues, sort of awkward and gangly figure who wasn't very good at being a soldier, but was very keen. He would forget his rifle and lose his glasses and things like that. But here's what he writes, and this is a day or two after arriving in Stalingrad. This is the story that he publishes. 2 months have passed since the fighting penetrated the city's tattered and burned body. The Germans plunged the knife of war right into the city's very heart, yet still the city lives. And it's Krieger, by the way, who comes up with this phrase, Stalingrad lives. The Germans readied the drums to announce the city's death, but now they're burying the drummers. This Russian city arises from the flames and the blood to drive the enemy back to its outskirts and deep underground into trenches, cellars, and crevices. The Germans came to realize they could never take the city alive. They decided to murder it. They'd slowly torture it to death. They took flight with thousands of tons of bombs. They dropped them onto the streets and squares where not long before girls had sold flowers, onto the boulevards and parks where gardeners had once tended young trees, and onto the bazaars where housewives had noisily hurried about their business. It's quite vivid, isn't it? This description of the city as a body being tortured, being penetrated, being burned. And I won't go into some of the more graphic descriptions you'll see, but I think if you read this, you'll be shocked at the violence that was allowed by the Soviet censorship. The descriptions of bodies being, people being torn apart, being killed, being sacrificed, animals suffering. You'd think that the Soviets would want to hide how bad it is, but no, the more the city suffers, the greater the burden, the greater the martyrdom, the greater the eventual resolution, the greater the eventual victory. And so ordinary people back home, and in the book I cover the responses of average readers by looking at letters and diaries, kind of echo the ways that writers like Paratiev are starting to kind of borrow other writers' ideas. And this is at the heart of my argument, that when people were traumatized, they needed these little building blocks of language to draw on, to build out their selfhood, to respond to this trauma. And this is why this story in particular has wormed its way so deeply into a sort of a subjectivity, a Russian subjectivity. So this is Lydia Medvedeva, who was a very junior tank commander at Stalingrad. And this is a postcard she wrote home. And if I can find it in my notes, put it somewhere. She writes, I wish I put page numbers on these. You'd think it would have been very intelligent. She writes back home, my dear, beloved Mama, Papa, Lyuba, Victor, Genechka, my felicitations on the day of the great festival, 7th of November, Happy Revolution Day, which is inspiring us to new heroic feats and the total destruction of the enemy. We're going to go on the advance and liberate our country and our people from the enemy's yoke. A few days earlier, she'd written, I don't think I'll go back to the Far East after the war. I'll stay somewhere here out west. After the war and the defeat of the enemy, I'm going to go home and give my brother Genechka a pistol as a souvenir. She quotes in these letters just bits and pieces of material that she's read at the front. Words, phrases, neologisms here and there. It informs her understanding of what's going on. Then what do we have? November the 19th, the miracle, supposedly. And the writers at the front literally do call it a miracle, repeatedly. In their diaries, in their notebooks, in their interactions with each other after the battle, and they do so publicly as well in what they're producing and publishing in the press. In Today in Stalingrad, which was published at the beginning of December, Grossman, who is really tortured by the idea of what he's seeing in late August and early September, writes about a kind of quite a lively scene of life in Stalingrad, of light spilling across the city, of the sun rising, of a new day, a new dawn, of snows melting, of ice melting. All these things symbolizing that if Simonov was stuck in days and nights, this perpetual fighting. Couldn't imagine a world without war, even though that was the task of the Soviet writer. Grossman is telling us here is the new day. Here is the new era. Here is that move in that storybook picture I showed you from blackness and destruction to reconstruction. The Germans, meanwhile, in that story, are hidden away from the sun and the daylight under the cruel stars of a Russian December night. They're starving. They're eating horse meat. They're broken. They become these sort of cockroach-like little creatures who can only scurry out at night, and when they do, they're petrified of the Russian invaders. However, this is not necessarily presented as the victory of the Russian people. The first couple of months has been all about ordinary people winning the battle, ordinary people standing firm. The city as a manifestation, a personification of the Russian people. Then who should come back but everybody's least favorite, not great dude, Joseph Stalin. And immediately, as soon as the victory is won, Stalin moves to seize credit for the victory. And there's a wonderful book by a scholar named Jan Plumper, who has studied Stalin's sort of depictions of Stalin, points out that Stalin basically didn't exist in the newspapers in the period when it looked like Stalingrad was about to fall, even though his name is attached to the city for reasons I won't go into now. But when they win, a couple of days later, what do we get? An editorial. There'll be a celebration on our street too, which is written by Ortenberg and a couple of others in the editorial offices back in Moscow. And if I can find the notes that I've messed up. Here is some bits from that story. Our spirit is higher and our will firmer than ever, wrote the city's defenders in a letter to Comrade Stalin. Our arms haven't yet tired of striking the enemy. We've chosen to defend Stalingrad to the death, and hold firm they did. They waited for that joyful, radiant hour of retribution, the advance of our forces at Stalingrad. In his missive of 7th of November, Stalin explained the day when the enemy would discover how strong the Red Army's new attacks would be was not far off. The nation is certain that under the leadership of our beloved commander, the great Stalin, our courageous troops will crush the fascist bandits and sweep the Soviet soil clean of the despicable enemy. It's pretty generic stuff. It's not great writing in the way that some of the writing that Grossman and Simonov were producing is great writing. And this trend for sort of Stalin's victory is expanded to bigger and bigger proportions throughout the rest of the war when the censorship returns. And then the war ends, and we get Stalin as demigod. Omniscient Stalin, who has foreseen everything, who in a 1946 novel by Ilya Ehrenburg, The Storm, one of the worst novels I've ever read, don't recommend it. Stalingrad foresaw the sun and the moon and the stars in order to win the victory, or Stalin foresaw them in order to win at Stalingrad. It was all a brilliant plan by Stalin. Yeah, 1 million people died on both sides, but it was all foreseen by godly Stalin. And you can see here what he's doing in this portrait on the right-hand side, which is from 1948-49. This is a map of Stalingrad, and you can see him here in his office, penciling out, literally drawing victory. And there is also a really bad propaganda film from 1949, The Battle of Stalingrad. It's 3 hours long, but you can watch it sped up on YouTube. Stalin is just in his office. He barely moves. He just picks up the phone, he draws things, and then all sorts of action happens. Little, ant-like little people scurry around when Stalin just sort of says, victory, advance, right? So this isn't engaging. And when Stalin dies, all of that stuff disappears from the story really quickly. But what remains is the material that has existed before November. Now, I want to just draw to a close by giving you a little quote from Goodbye Stalingrad, which is the last story from the Stalingrad period in the book, and that's written by Vasily Karateev, this native Stalingrader. And you can imagine when he's writing this, But he's not really just writing propaganda. He's not writing to his readers. He's writing for himself. He's working out this trauma. He's working out what's happened. Stalingrad's inhabitants bid the departing troops a fond farewell. They thank their beloved defenders with all their hearts, wishing them luck in battle as they gaze on at the departing columns. The home of Nazarenko, fire brigade chief, has miraculously remained intact through the bombing and shelling. There's the miracle. The home's inhabitants stand by the road, waving his hat cordially at the passing troops. His wife is alongside, wiping away the tears with a headscarf. She says, "We left under the Germans for 3 months. I'll never forget the first of our soldiers who came into the house. I don't know his name though. Now I'm standing here and looking, I hope I might recognize him. I just wish I knew his name so I could remember it forever." That is not writing that you would think of as Stalinist, as impersonal. That is very heartfelt. And that's why Stalingrad has such an emotional impact on these readers. You can imagine poor Lydia Medvedeva in her tank reading this and thinking, yes, this is what I see. I know my town has been destroyed. Russia is still on the brink of destruction. And in fact, she dies a few months later. She's captured, she's taken to a concentration camp, and she's killed. So what happens afterwards? Well, Stalingrad, as you know, goes on. Hundreds of books, hundreds of films, or dozens of films, plays, poems, all reiterating this language over and over again, all with the core idea that Stalingrad wasn't a terrible tragedy. It was a necessary triumph, a necessary sacrifice that brings about the birth of a new day, the dawn of a new historical era. No matter how bad things are today, we might see things anew tomorrow. And Grossman regrets this deeply, the way things have gone, and that's what he writes about in Life and Fate. Ortenberg is fired for reasons that aren't entirely clear, except almost certainly anti-Semitism. Just after Stalingrad, there is a wave of anti-Semitism that goes across the propaganda apparatus, and yet he never lets go of the idea of Stalingrad. And he goes back in the 1970s, and he writes a memoir of the time, and he draws on this language and describes Stalingrad as this city that rose from the ashes to defend the nation, almost verbatim quoting that Yevgeny Krieger piece about the city's pierced and tattered body. So he regrets a lot, but he doesn't regret this part. But what we do have is corruption of this story today, a deep corruption by the regime in power, where it's completely stripped out any contributions made by anybody who isn't Russian. And it's used to justify violence in the present, whether that's the battle for Donetsk airport in 2014 or today. Just yesterday, a Russian propagandist, sort of Muscovite hipster who works in the media apparatus, who I've had the misfortune to have words with in the past, wrote on his Telegram channel, he has many thousands of followers. He posted a video from Mariupol. And he writes, "Mariupol, the Stalingrad of our times. An unhealed wound, a terrible pain, but the people's spirit is unbreakable. The city will be rebuilt. Azovstal will be a beautiful new landscape garden right on the banks of the Azov Sea." So at least in the imagination of the Russian nationalists today, this is a promise that the nation has had to go through destruction, has had to see the sacrifice of troops at the front, and regrettably the sacrifice of Russian citizens, who of course aren't Russians, in order to build this sort of utopian new world of gardens. And of course, the quality of this sort of propaganda compared to Grossman's writing and Erdelburg's writing and Simonov's writing is shit, if you'll excuse my French. It's lazy. But you can begin to see where these stories emerge. And that is the note that I will end on. Except to say, please buy my book. It's a snip at $75. Yeah, I know, academic publishing, eh? All right. Should we take some questions?
Yes. I just stopped sharing the screen so the
Oh, yeah, for sure.
audience from Zoom could participate as well. Okay, so we're taking questions from the audience and from the Zoom audience. In Zoom, please use the raise your hand button, and here just raise your hand.
So when discussing the more modern, you did mention protests that minority ourselves, like women, ethnic members of like the Kazakh community, people from Ukraine were in our general written groups. But how and how often were they included in the original narratives? Like you say, ordinary people, but I have very little background, so I can't quite identify just period names. Like what could constitute a minority person in the Russian context?
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you asked me this question because somebody asked me at my PhD defense 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So yeah, hold on. I'm just going to give you some quotes from the book. So during the period of the battle, when you read the stories from before, especially from before November the 19th, you will think, hold on, there are a handful of Kazakhs. There are a handful of obviously Jewish names here. There are some Ukrainians. There are stories of these sort of wild Siberian snipers who've grown up hunting wolves and now they're hunting Germans at the front, right? But immediately from this description, you understand that these people in this depiction are kind of essentialized. They tend to be, the depictions tend to be very flat, very flimsy, and they're thrown in for sort of ethnic color, right? Here is a representative Soviet Union. Here is, you know, Friendship of Nations thrown into these stories. So you, the Kazakh reader reading this at the front, you can see somebody a bit like you. But it doesn't really ever go much beyond that, except with one notable exception, that is Grossman. And Grossman writes this beautiful story called In the Gully on the Steppe. That's all about a unit that trains up, marches to Stalingrad, and he tells the story of two troops, a Russian and a Kazakh. And in their first battle, the story focuses on the first battle, the Kazakh is killed, which is sad, regrettable, but Grossman paints it in these very humanistic terms. And he spends a lot of time in the story describing the burial that this Kazakh fighter gets, describing his words, talking about the genuine and deep sadness that his comrades had when they saw him fall, rather than saying, oh, and by the way, there was some Kazakh dude in the regiment as well, which is how most of the stories function. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. By the sounds of it, they were included at least nominally in the 1940s depictions, whereas in retrospective work, they just are completely opposite.
Yeah, pretty much. Today, you will notice, though, has anyone seen the 2013 movie? The Bondarchuk movie?
Which one?
Stalingrad. Yeah, okay. No, you're not big Stalingrad nerds. It's not as big as me. What a surprise. So this was a huge blockbuster, 2013. Fyodor Bondarchuk, who is, you know, big director. It got the most domestic funding that any Russian film has ever done.
Mainly the son of a big director.
Mainly the son of a big director. Let's not talk about that. And no nepotism here. $30 million budget, record box office takings in Russia for a domestic movie, was voted the public's favorite film of the year, including one review that I quoted in my PhD, which was along the lines of, "I love you, Stalingrad." There is this deep identification with the idea of the battle. It rehashes the themes we see in this battle. And one of the things it does is describe the defense of house. And those of you who are Stalingrad nerds might have heard of Pavlov's house in Stalingrad, this house that was supposedly defended for weeks on end by this ragtag bunch of ordinary Soviet troops. Not as important to the story as some people make out. However, Bondarchuk brings it back, and there are, I believe, 5 troops and they're sort of representative of the nations of the Soviet Union. So there is, I believe he's Kazakh, but I might be wrong. They may not even mention the nationality, but he's your sort of generic Central Asian cardboard cutout character. There is a generic Ukrainian character. There is a generic suffering and weak and feeble woman, and so on and so forth. So this is not advanced stuff. Who is the real hero? Who does the real fighting and makes the real decision to call in an airstrike at the end of the movie, to blow the house up to save the bigger effort at Stalingrad? It's the Russian guy, right? It's always the Russians who come charging over the hill, out of the trenches, leading, making the greatest sacrifices.
Can I add a
Yeah,
little
sure.
bit? It's to, as a matter of fact, the agency, the propaganda agency created by Sherbakov, the Soviet Bureau, included the ethnic subdivisions, such as Soviet Anti-Fascist Jewish Committee, Soviet Anti-Fascist Slavic Committee, Soviet Anti-Fascist Women's Committee, Soviet Anti-Fascist Youth Committee, those responsible for targeting the audiences in the West, specifically in regards to the experiences of their groups, Jews, women, youth, Slavs of different countries, and so on. And it's also very interesting how the Western recipients approach these materials. I used to work in the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, which received the materials from the Soviet Anti-Fascist Jewish Committee. So they set them aside as propaganda. They just, okay, thank you for informing us.
Perfect. We have a question online, or we have questions in the room?
Yes, let's take one question online and then from the room. Leonid, please.
Oh, hi, Ian and Vasily. Thank you very much, Ian, for this wonderful presentation. I really appreciated this intersection of history and literature. And it's just, I think it helps our understanding the experiences of people at the time. And that's given all the stress that happens afterwards, right? I just want to bring us back to that time when Simonov and Ortenberg and others were writing, experiencing what they experienced for the people that were also experiencing all this. What exactly and how exactly do they convey a sense of hope? Based on what you already told us, clearly it was not, Comrade Stalin is there, he will take care of us, right? So, but what exactly did they say? Because this is arguably one of those deeply humane, survivalist, existentialist moment, right, that they all experience. And part of it may be ideology, part of it may be nationalism, but maybe there's something else there. If you could perhaps encapsulate that a little bit.
So I'd say there were two principal ways. Historically, in terms of the material they drew on, you will find that this is packed with references to 1812 and Napoleon, to War and Peace. Read the index. 90% of the index is just, here is another reference to War and Peace. We've done this before. Moscow almost fell. We can do it again. We can do it again. It's just what Russians do. We repel invaders, right? So this idea of this sort of fatedness of the Russian people to fight these sorts of battles and win. And the other is in the way that individuals are wrapped into these stories. These ideas of these sort of almost Stakhanovite soldiers and troops who do miraculous things. The idea being the way that they put this together, you too can do this, right? You on the home front, you may be just sewing tunics for the troops, but those tunics are worn by Shkolenko, who goes off on a scouting mission by himself and captures a German machine gun. And then he comes back and he goes off another scouting mission the same day. And isn't that, this is the end of that story, which is by Simonov, isn't that just like the Battle of Borodino in 1812, right? So there is this sort of wrapping of individuals, and I didn't get too much into depth in this in the book because I ran out of words. We've all been there. But in the PhD, I described at length the development of kind of Stalingrad chronotype. right? And it is the entrance of individuals into a time and a place that is distinctly mythic, distinctly epic in scope, that makes it seem possible that in a fractured and fragmented world in which meaning and reality is collapsing, you can cling on to something, and what you do matters, and your survival matters. So I read my PhD. It's even more obscure than this.
While doing your research, how much did you find in the way of believable, by your judgment, accounts of what happened in Stalingrad? The Germans, after all, were defeated, were thrown out.
So I'm glad you asked, actually. It's a really good question. You'd think that many of these stories are gutted up with sort of mistruths and untruths because that was the way of the Soviet writing of the 1930s. However, what is astonishing is that when I looked back at contemporary letters and diaries and the notebooks of people like Simonov and Grossman, I was able to put lots of different things together. I also looked at military records that are probably no longer available to ordinary people like me. And it is amazing how much of it can be verified as true, right? And the reason that I suppose that this is probably the case is, firstly, there is no ask on the part of the state to come up with these ridiculous superheroes anymore. It has to be more real. But also simply because this is a huge battle where the writers are stationed with the troops, and therefore they find it easy to find relatively incredible feats that people are carrying out. And Shkolenko, this scout that I just mentioned, to give an example. So Simonov was at the front, and he got a tip-off from Ortenberg, who'd heard from somebody else that Shkolenko had done this amazing thing. And so Simonov spent a few hours with Shkolenko on the eastern bank of the river where it was a bit safer, talking to him. He went to talk to his commanders. He went to talk to the other people in his unit, right? This is almost real journalistic work before you start layering it into this sort of mythic literary world of Borodino and socialist realism and achievements. And so it starts with something real. It starts with real documentarianism. Is that a word? Sure, let's say it is. That's what academics make up words all the time.
Okay, well, let's take one more question from the audience and one more question from online. If there is no online questions, 2 questions from the audience.
Perfect. You've had your hand up for a while, so maybe.
Okay, yeah.
Small question.
Great.
Thank you for such a great presentation. It's very interesting. I'm wondering if post Stalin's death, or maybe after his denunciation by Khrushchev, there were any denunciations of this, cult of personality that he created associated to Stalingrad? Like, were there any maybe personal notes by these writers, or open claims against this kind of contribution of his to battle?
So I'm glad you asked. It's an excellent question, because what I haven't mentioned is that in the close of this, I include 2 stories, one that was written 10 years after the battle, just before Stalin died, and one that was written 22, 23 years after the battle. The first is by Vasily Karateev, and he never lets go of this image of Stalingrad as being this sort of perfect tragedy, right? And in the story, he goes back to Stalingrad and he sort of looks at the ways in which it's being reconstructed, and he's wowed by all the progress they've made. The amazing planetarium they're building, definitely not built with German slave labor. Doesn't mention that, funnily enough. And he goes throughout the rest of his life, he keeps writing about Stalingrad, right? He never writes a novel. He wanted to write a novel, but he felt he couldn't do it justice. So he writes short stories. That's all he can manage. And he's an interesting figure. But the other story is by Viktor Nekrasov. And Nekrasov is a Ukrainian Russian writer, very confusing nationality questions around Nekrasov. And he wrote in 1946 a novel that could be conceived as being anti-Stalinist. It's called
Stalin's Prize.
But it did get a Stalin Prize. So it's a beautiful novel. It draws principally on the work of Simonov. Nekrasov was at Stalingrad. He almost met Grossman at Stalingrad, but he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it basically gives the credit to victory to the people, the fighters. And in the Nekrasov story I have, it's called an incident on the Mamayev Kurgan, which is this central hill. He goes back to Stalingrad 20 years later as a veteran. And the story is, please excuse my bad language, what one of my friends described as a complete mindfuck. He kind of falls through time. He goes into the place where he fought, and he falls through time and imagines that he's fighting the battle again, but he starts to completely unravel, and he can't figure out what's the past and what's the present, what's real, what's not, whether he's fighting, whether he's not, what are the results of de-Stalinization, what does Stalingrad mean? And he ends up basically drinking and getting a hangover. Classic Russian literature, right? It's a really good Stalingrad story, and I think I would make the case that it is, alongside Life and Fate, it is the single best piece of Stalingrad fiction that's ever been written. It's astonishingly good. My translation doesn't do it justice. And so what we find is this awkwardness about Stalin amongst the people who fought there and amongst the people who created this myth. And publicly, at least, we get a de-Stalinization of Stalingrad, at least for a time, when the Battle of Stalingrad becomes the battle on the Volga. And Simonov's novels about Stalingrad get republished, but literally they just go through and take out the word Stalin, Stalingrad, it becomes the city on the Volga, it becomes Volgograd, it becomes the battle on the Volga, the decisive battle, right? All these euphemisms, but never Stalin. So there is a sort of literal de-Stalinization, but never a confrontation with the idea that actually, and this of course most definitely isn't happening today, the idea that 1 million people had to die was worthy or right in some way, rather than regretted. Those tendencies have only ever been very superficial, and indeed today there is the renaming of Volgograd into Stalingrad on holidays and occasional discussions about turning it back into Stalingrad. There is the Stalingrad regiment that I showed you, the idea that we're gonna do Stalingrad today. Можем повторить, right? Anna.
I have a sort of an unfair question. So forgive me. And I'm curious as to what the other side is doing. So what were the Germans? If you think about it as, you've got these Russians that are embedded, they're and again, you may not know, or there may be something written on it, but is there a comparative effort on the other side to see this as a kind of great Nazi moment where?
Yeah, absolutely there is. There's a really good book on it by, I believe the name is Christina Morena, and it is, what's it? Marina, is that right? Excellent. And I believe, and I haven't read this in years, so I might be really butchering this, the Germans kind of create this much more high-flown mythical narrative of Nibelungs and, epic sort of German stuff that I don't want to touch on too much. But yes, they're trying to create something, and they try and, when they ultimately surrender, this is supposed to be this sort of the shame of the nation, and yet somehow the triumph of the nation. And you have to read Marina's book to work out exactly how it's done, because that seems really baffling to me.
Sort of a competing mythology.
But yeah, absolutely, it's mythologized in some grand fashion.
One last bonus question.
Rebecca will chat afterwards.
Thanks, this was really well delivered. I guess my biggest question is, you've done a really great job at demonstrating how current politicians in Russia are using stories like this to further propaganda, basically. But what I'm wondering is, what do you think, to what extent do you think history has motivated this war generally? And so not just, I know it's a big, I'm not asking you to quantify it, but Because, you know, you've shown us how history is used, justified, or to what extent it motivates people.
It strikes.
Sorry.
Maybe this is a pitch for my next book, which is coming out on May the 4th, and it only costs £22, which is much more reasonable. And I'm looking at the emergence of youth fascism today. And I talked to some really scary people about what's going on in Russia today. And I make the argument there that Putin's guiding idea is the recreation, and I call it a fascist myth because it's the recreation, or kind of the idea that we can achieve a history, a past that was never real. And I've talked about the ways in which this sacrifice made at Stalingrad wasn't necessarily real, right? It wasn't attached to reality, even though, as we pointed out, elements of plot, elements of description were real. Right? It's the idea that somehow we can reach into the past and recreate these moments in which Russia was supposedly at its greatest. And that's why we can slap together a bit of Tsarist stuff, a bit of Soviet stuff, a bit of Brezhnev, a bit of medieval fantasy, you name it, we'll just slap it all together. And the thing that keeps coming back is the idea that Russia is a country that fights. Russia is a country that has to make war to make itself. That's the binding idea behind all of this. And of course, the greatest of all wars, supposedly, is the Great Patriotic War. And that's why they're constructing this sort of religion, the cult of the Great Patriotic War around it. So small question, or small answer to a very big question, but a good question.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for your